The Spin-off Podcast Network.
Hey there, Ryan Reynolds here. It's a new year, and you know what that means. No, not the diet. Resolutions. A way for us all to try and do a little bit better than we did last year. And my resolution, unlike big wireless, is to not be a raging and raise the price of wireless on you every chance I get. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment required, equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes on unlimited. See mintmobile.com for details.
Kia ora, this is Toby Manhire. This has gone by lunchtime. It's holiday time, isn't it? So we're all, at this moment, Ben, Annabelle, me, Ti here, all floating around on lilos and different bodies of water. And to give you something just to tide you over, perhaps an episode of something from 2024. I don't even know what it is while I'm recording this intro. Hope it's good.
And now, presenting before a live studio audience at the Hannah Playhouse in Wellington, Gone by Lunchtime.
Tēnā koutou katoa, no mai haere mai. Welcome to this special live spin-off podcast crossover edition, Gone by Jugger Time. We thought the best way to get as far as possible from American politics today, which is not a nice place, is to be in New Zealand and 40 years ago, before we knew what might befall us. Welcome, Annabelle Mather.
Kia ora, tēnā tātou.
Did I pay close attention to Annabelle's fashion choices today?
Leg warmers, 1980s, shoulder pads, taffeta.
Incredible, incredible. Welcome, Ben Thomas. Kia ora.
Kia ora.
So, 40 years ago today, and the top of the singles chart in New Zealand was Nelson Mandela by the Specials. The top of the cinema bills was Police Academy, the first Police Academy film. Classic. 3 is better, but classic. First Police Academy film. Playing in this theatre and downstage was Tartuffe by Molière, one of your faves, Annabelle.
I'm not classy enough to know what that is.
Things have moved on a lot since then. In order to make the hometown crowd feel more comfortable, we'll do the second half of the podcast as a play about a baby boomer couple re-evaluating their marriage against the backdrop of a rugby tour.
I'm sure that has seen many, many, many famous nights in this particular establishment. What else was going on? It was election day. It was election day, exactly 40 years to the day. Most of you know this story. After 9 years, Muldoon leading the national government on that night on June 14. He had a few whiskies, a few brandies, and on the pretext of Marilyn Waring quitting caucus, said that they would go to the polls. There'll be a snap election. It was a 4-week election campaign. Didn't work out for Muldoon because David Lange kept on going up steps through the campaign. And on election night, on July 14, 40 years ago in Mangere, the Metro Theatre, Lange, there are a couple of phone calls that I think are quite instructive that were kind of foreshadowed what was to come. One was from George Shultz, who was in Canberra on his way to an ANZUS meeting. It was just a courtesy call, really, but it was a reminder to Lange of the big test that awaited in foreign policy. And then the second call he got was from Muldoon, and it was a concession call, but by Lange's account, what he said is, "Congratulations, I've got some bad news for you tomorrow." And that bad news turned out to be a currency crisis, which morphed into a financial crisis, which morphed into a constitutional crisis, all of which together was the the sort of powder keg that exploded into the radical reforms through the fourth Labour government and what we call Rogernomics. There's one bit of audio we wanted to play for you. Some of you will have heard it in the podcast. We managed to get hold of it thanks to Judith Fife and Hugo Manson and the Alexander Turnbull Library. Judith Fife and Hugo Manson, New Zealand treasures in their own right, did this project during the 84 election where they talked to many of the leaders on sort of contemporaneously as the election went through. And this is Longy talking about being on the stage at the Mangere Metro Theatre on July 14, 84.
People don't know, but the hall that I stood on as the Prime Minister is the stage that I played a block of cheese in. I was a block of cheese with legs in a primary school function. There's not many people have done that. And I thought of that when I was standing up there too. It doesn't make particularly good television because you get distracted.
I just love that detail, the block of cheese, to have that moment. You can hear Judith Fife chuckling in the background. Annabelle, you're a child of the 80s, as evidenced here. What do you remember of that campaign of Longy and Douglas? Do you have anything that sticks in the mind from back then?
First of all, can I say that, like, if you wanted to capture the female vote, like a Prime Minister who is a block of cheese is the surefire way to do it.
Is that right? Okay, good.
I think so, yeah.
All right.
Maybe if you had a co-leader who was red wine, you know.
Any particular cheese or just a standard cheddar?
I think just a nice hard cheese.
Vintage cheddar.
And just to jump in, of course, some great detail and juggernaut about how Longy sort of found his voice and his confidence. If YouTube has taught me anything, it appears to be the Alexander technique when he was younger. But part of the story of the government is David Longy's transition and all of the problems that started when he became sexy. So I don't know that Annabelle's on the right track here.
Be relatable for you, Ben.
Tell me about your memories of that time, Bells.
I remember politics being everywhere in my life, but not really understanding it. I remember growing up watching McPhail and Gadsby, and their very vivid portrayal of what was happening in New Zealand politics, something that I feel like we really miss today, that sort of satirical approach to what's happening. My parents were very political. My family from, waterside workers down here in Wellington in the 51 lockout. My mum very active in mana motuhake. The socialist standard literally in the toilet. So it was everywhere, but I didn't really understand it. And in terms of participation, in 1983, my mum had won a seat on the local council. And so we thought politics was great because we got to drive around on the bonnet of my dad's car, leafleting letterboxes in the middle of the night on Waiheke.
Wow. Was your mum involved in mana motuhake at that point?
Right from the start.
Yeah, right. Because Matiu Rata, who was one of the participants in that series of interviews that I was just talking about that were included in the book The Gamble, he had left Labour and was standing for mana motuhake, but it didn't go well for them in that 84 electorate. Just got lost, I guess, or got no media attention. Do you know?
I think then there was a different culture around politics. It was still first past the post, and Māori just saw themselves as being very staunch Labour, even though Matiu, in my opinion, is one of the unsung heroes of Māori politics in terms of not only the establishment of the Waitangi Tribunal and the settlement process and what that has done to empower Māori, but also as Minister of Lands, how much whenua he actually returned back to Māori hands. So I think, unfortunately, we were just creatures of habit back then.
Ben Thomas, I like to imagine, and I hope you won't disabuse me of this image, you as a child with a scrapbook, collecting pictures of all the different party leaders and sketching out extended metaphors that you could use in the playground to amuse your friends?
No, I think I remember watching, not that opening sequence, but I remember watching election night coverage in 1984 when I must have been like 5 and a half.
Yeah.
And it was about, must have been like 4 or 5 kilometres from here in Rhine Street in Island Bay, where we lived very close to the accoutrement of Robert Muldoon's New Zealand. We were across the road from Taputaranga Marae, where I went to Kohangareo, which had started during Muldoon's time as Prime Minister. The marae had been pretty much built and landscaped by mongrel mob members on community service, which is why for most of my life I thought that the mongrel mob were just community-minded people who liked landscaping. And
Muldoon was quite good mates.
He was big on the gangs. Yeah, that's right. And so there certainly wasn't any kind of stigma around it, as I recall then. And I do remember watching it. I didn't really know anything about politics. I did know that Robert Muldoon was the Prime Minister. I think my parents must have given me a quick rundown about that Labour were the opposition and National were the government, and deploying skills that would later make me one of New Zealand's top pundits. I made a call and decided we must have a Labour government. And probably really annoyed my parents for the rest of the night until they put me to bed. We're talking about,
They're quite scary-looking characters as kids, eh? Muldoon and Longy. I remember that. I remember thinking, are these the two guys? Like, these guys look freaky.
I remember thinking they were pretty overweight, but now I'm sort of like, wow, quite dashing sort of prime ministers, like
svelte,
handsome men clashing in the
athletes. I have sort of mixed up in my brain as well, I think, with Muldoon, who was that kind of bogeyman figure in lots of ways. I said to my parents, I remember you saying, go to bed or Muldoon will come and get you. And so that's absolutely not true. But somehow I'd kind of got into my head that he was this. But I've also got it mixed up with Muldoon when he, in his later career, I think while still in Parliament, was the narrator on the Rocky Horror Show, so made up and sitting like this.
And also the presenter on the Friday Frights.
That's
on
right.
TV2.
Yeah.
It's quite interesting watching that clip because you look at the wives and the wives look like they've got their shit together. Like you could roll those aunties out today and they are impressive.
Yeah.
And the husbands all look like Simpsons characters.
On Muldoon...
We were talking about this in the green room, that, there is this kind of recovered, fake recovered memory syndrome of New Zealand in the 80s, where it's like, shoulder pads and gloss and, I lived in Fielding for like the second half of the 80s. The only shoes anyone had were like white canvas tennis shoes. I didn't know Nike existed until I moved to Auckland as a teen. Well,
that was what the fourth Labour government gave us, was Nike.
That's right.
That's the whole point. On Muldoon, because one of the interesting things that, people have been reflecting on at the time of this anniversary is the way that all the dots join to politics today. Muldoon today, is there anyone in the National Party who will stand up for Muldoon? Is there anyone who will go... Because, if you read Gustafson's book, Barry Gustafson's book, the great political historian, he kind of says there has been a bit of caricaturing. In some ways, it's very easy for everybody to just go, Muldoon was the source of everything that was bad. Have you ever met anyone in the National Party circles who will say, well, actually, a word for Muldoon?
I personally haven't, no.
But you know what I mean? Like, he's not someone that ever gets on the honours board at National Party conferences, right?
It's true that, nobody ever talks about what a great thing Clyde Dam was. As with anyone who was Prime Minister for sort of 9 years, and Kohangareo started during his time. So, it's very rare, particularly in New Zealand, where we have a pretty centrist sort of governments that, there won't be any good mixed in with the bad. But of course the flag, is flown by another National Party apostate, which is the Deputy Prime Minister, Winston Peters.
Yeah. I did when researching for Juggernaut, I looked through Hansard for references to Fourth Labour government, Long Ian Douglas, Rogernomics, and so on. It was quite an interesting exercise, isn't it? You quite quickly, you could mask who was speaking and quite easily guess which party that came from, because if it was kind of broadly sympathetic to the things that the government had done, it's national. If it was full-on love it, what a great government there was, it's ACT Party. If it's very sort of tortured and uncertain and slightly self-loathing and shoegazing, then it's the Labour Party. And if it's nostalgic and actually kind of includes a little bit of what we lost, it's the New Zealand First Party. It's still, I do think, Annabelle, it does inform a lot of the politics today still. Hipkins gave this speech, right? Earlier this year, he gave a speech on Labour values as part of the kind of building back the Labour Party, and he made a specific reference to, he said, this year we will mark a significant and challenging milestone in Labour's history, the 40-year anniversary of the election of the Fourth Labour government. We will remember with pride the early steps the government took to stamp our proudly nuclear-free mark on foreign policy, the work the government to advance human rights, including homosexual law reform, conservation, environmental issues, tum to tum. But we will also look back with much more mixed feelings on the economic reforms of that and subsequent governments and the 4 decades of growing inequality and societal decay that has followed. I mean, it's still this sort of inexorable companion that Labour has to deal with today, right?
It is, and it's interesting for me as a journalist because so much of the mahi that me and Mihi do, when you follow the whakapapa of it, it comes down to that period. And although I've known that, when we've done stories about Minginui, a forestry town that has like the most horrendous housing you can ever imagine, and an unbelievable unemployment rate and all of those things, and you trace it down. But one of the things I thought was fascinating about Juggernaut was I hadn't put together in my head that housing affordability that traces its whakapapa back to the 1987 stock market crash and everybody wanting to invest in brick and tile and all of those things. So for me, it's been so fascinating listening to how it all came about and the personalities and the thinking behind it. But, today, as a journalist, when you look at the devastating consequences of those decisions and those actions that were undertaken so incredibly swiftly, it's remarkable.
I think a lot of what happened was that it was difficult to move on from the sort of, what you might call the neoliberal reforms, in part because of the response to them, which was MMP. And MMP, it was very conscious, in terms of the campaigning at the time. We don't, Geoffrey Palmer talking about unbridled power. We don't want to give the government of the day the ability to just, pull everything out from under our feet, change, upend all of society. But what that meant was you kind of locked everything in at around 1996, probably to a much greater extent than maybe some other countries, whether you wanted to go further or whether you wanted to retreat. And there's a very good argument that a lot of our politics, in terms of the parties, is still shaped by the 80s. New Zealand First really is, sort of what could be better than the 1970s. And ACT was formed specifically to keep the reforms going. It's evolved and changed as a party now, and I think so has New Zealand First. But the Labour Party, when I was working in Parliament, you could make the Labour guys wince any time by mentioning the Fourth Labour government. It was still this very real sort of shadow that hung over them, and I think it probably was there until the last person who had been present sort of retired. And the Nats, they're a Tory party, they're just going to keep going, just keep winning elections. They're pretty unbothered by everything. But what was interesting is that in terms of locking it all in, Labour and National did become these very centrist, and they were encouraged to become centrist by MMP and the logic of it, centrist incrementalist parties. And the people, the wars were still being fought, but they were being fought on the margins. New Zealand First Act, United Future, Peter Dunson, asking everyone to remember that he was there.
Yeah. So those two.
While all of his colleagues asked people to forget.
It was like there was an orthodoxy sort of cemented in at that point in some way, Annabelle.
Yeah, and we've never really veered off course from it. Like it was all. Well, I think what's fascinating is that all of that economic reform happened so quickly, and yet it's been cemented in, and so much of it has just become accepted as the way we do economics, the way we do politics, and so we've come to accept incredible inequity and all of those sorts of things. I was having a look at some of the stats, and by 1992, after everything had been sold off or corporatised, the unemployment rate for Māori was 25%. 10% for the general population, 25% for Māori. So, it continues to reverberate throughout Māori society, and I think, it's right up there with almost with the land wars in terms of, how the devastation that it caused economically to Māori.
And the rejoinder from the people who are in the, in that fourth Labour government is always, well, what would you change? What would you take back? And so, there's an argument that what was wrong was the pace at which the reforms were undertaken, or the speed or the sequencing. We didn't get it in the right order like they did in Australia when they were deregulating.
It started earlier.
Yeah. It started earlier, went on a little longer, didn't quite have the same sort of blitzkrieg. And it is, I think, there's a lot to that argument. People have been complaining about the Reserve Bank and monetary policy for years and years and years since Don Brash was the governor, saying, why do we outsource it to these guys who don't care about unemployment? They don't care about all of these important social issues. Then, as soon as inflation gets away on us for the first time in 25 years, everyone loses their fucking minds. And society just about disintegrates. And you go, oh, yeah, okay, maybe they're onto something there, same thing for tariffs and, sector subsidies. There's a lot of questions about the way in which the reforms happened. But not a lot of, outside again, New Zealand First, appetite for kind of dismantling them.
Toby, when you were making the podcast and you were interviewing all of those people, did any of them express, not remorse, but had anyone sort of reevaluated it and maybe thought that perhaps it wasn't the best course to take, or had anyone shifted positions?
I don't think anyone had changed profoundly. People had sort of, many of the people I spoke to were able to say that they could now, like Heke Parata, for example, were able to see parts of the change and their impact that weren't obvious at the time.
What did she say? She drank the Kool-Aid.
She did. She said she drank the Kool-Aid, and that she perhaps didn't appreciate the extent to which the impact was on some Māori communities. But she was working hard to devolve power to Māori communities. The thing that's really interesting about it is that the main players, particularly Roger Douglas and Richard Prebble, their views have calcified. There is, in fact, they've kept going. In some case, Roger, I mentioned this in some of the podcast. I think that. Roger Douglas came into the studio with screeds of pages of his latest, alternative budget, having done alternative budgets in the 70s, and he's still going, and he still just wants to, he's still there with his fucking whiteboard and drawing waiting for everybody to finally come around to see how things could be. And also, I think with some of them, to be fair, there is a part of when you tell a story so many times and when you make an argument so many times, boy, it's a hard thing to then, you need to sort of stop and have before you can see things in a different way. And I think certainly with Prebble and Douglas, they haven't stopped and they won't stop. And that's so, but striking, for example, We interviewed someone who grew up in Kaingaroa, which is one of those forestry towns, and just near Manginui, and played Prebble saying, no one ever complained about being made redundant.
They wrote to say thank you for making me redundant.
No, he said people wrote to him saying they should have been made redundant.
Yeah.
And that they missed out on the chance to participate in the new economy.
There are those bits where you just kind of go, what? So, yeah.
Have you spent time thinking about the counterfactual? Like if Longy had accepted Douglas's recommendations to go after the health system next and all of that stuff?
Yeah, I mean, there are so many of those, aren't there? Like, there are so many sliding doors moments. Probably there are in every story, but this one particularly because the consequences were so big and foundational. And it goes all the way back to what the sort of starting point of it. If you hadn't had Muldoon holding on to things so tightly, if you hadn't had him going to the electorate early, and therefore meaning that Labour didn't need to complete their manifesto, that they could just throw something together. If you didn't have the crisis in those days that followed, that provided this incredible springboard for that level of radical reform, I don't think that would have happened. It needed all those ingredients. And it also probably needed Longy as the great orator, the man who could, and I don't necessarily say this pejoratively, who could sell it, who could make the case to New Zealand. If you didn't have the nuclear-free campaign going on at the same time, that meant that many people in the party felt as though they were getting what they demanded, whereas otherwise their attention might have turned more to changes to, the economy. So yeah, so many of those things.
Yeah, stuff. You think that, like, I was thinking how nuclear free, we wouldn't have had that if we didn't have Rogernomics, the Waitangi Tribunal being able to look retrospectively. We wouldn't have had that if we didn't have the other thing too. It's quite a mind bend.
What do you think on that, on the impacts for Te Ao Māori, which I talked to Hekia a bit about? Like you say, the Waitangi Tribunal remit was extended back, which was a big thing very early on in the Labour government. There was a lot of stitching the treaty principles, which is an issue now, obviously, for obvious reasons, into legislation and the judiciary. And yet there were Māori communities that you mentioned that got slammed. What do you think obviously it's simplistic to say impacts for Māori. There were many different impacts. But what do you think overall the fourth Labour government's legacy for Te Ao Māori was?
Just economic devastation, I have to be honest, and that has expressed itself in a number of ways. Gangs, crime, intergenerational poverty, homelessness, educational failure, all of those things, and although they extended the remit of the Waitangi Tribunal, they also changed the legislation so that you could no longer lodge claims over private land, and that was following the Alan Titford saga, who you guys might remember from up north back in the day. So devastating consequences for Māori. It's kind of hard to think your way around it. But on the flip side, in 1984, fun fact, Poie, that was good. And Te Māori went to New York. So, despite the horrors of that period, Māori achieved amazing things. And Aoreo grew.
And there are a few contradictions in there, like, Ben mentioned Kohanga Reo was established under the Muldoon government. Te Māori, that amazing exhibition, that was signed off under a national government too, and then, happened. So there are a few things that are more complicated than the very, simplistic versions. We've now hit over 40 minutes, and so we kind of run out of things to say, because that's normally the length of a podcast. But we do have a fourth seat here, and I'm thinking hopefully if we can find somebody here who might be a familiar voice from around about the times, like that person there.
Come.
Here we go.
No mai, hana mai.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome
The
to
Queen.
the stage, Kim Hill.
I too am wearing something very old. This is fun, isn't it, group chat?
It's like a therapy session.
I know. I feel a bit of an imposter, really, because I wasn't in the country in 84.
Tell us where you were in 1984.
Well, in 81, I was in Nelson reporting on the Springbok tour, and then Muldoon got in, and I would like to say, as a matter of principle, I had to leave the country at that point. But no, it was just time for the OE, right? So I went away, and in 1984, when the election was won, we were in Darjeeling in some weird hotel listening to Hotel California, which was odd. And we didn't even know that an election had taken place until July the 23rd. But look, I found my diary.
Wow.
I found my diary, and on the 14th of July, I finished, because you know how you pick up these books when you're travelling and then you drop them off, you pick them up. I finished Schindler's Ark. Very good book, I said. Schindler's wife, Emily, said that Oscar had done nothing astounding before the war and had been unexceptional since. He was fortunate, therefore, that in that short, fierce era between 1939 and 45, you fill in the numbers, he had met people who had summoned forth his deeper talents. Well, I think that's very significant. For David Longy. I'm thinking David Longy. That's all I have to contribute from my diary. I was very sick. Do you want to hear about the amoebic dysentery? Goes on for quite a while. Oh, yes, 23rd of July. Labour, David Longy, has won the New Zealand election. Great news, New Zealand. Has also devalued its dollar by 20%. Also good news for our pound. There you are.
Amazing.
And what did you come back and do after that? Did you go straight to RNZ thereafter?
No, we went to Australia to earn some money.
Yeah.
In the glory days of journalists being able to earn money. And
the devalued dollar.
And with the devalued. And then we came back to New... And also, I'd like to say, oh my God, I was so excited by the late government. I had to stay, blah, blah. No. We borrowed my brother's Toyota Lux thing. And because my partner was Welsh and had never been to New Zealand before, so we travelled all over the place, got down to the Mackenzie country, fully intended to go back to Australia. I said, I can't leave, I just love it. The Mackenzie country. Ended up in Wellington. Working for Checkpoint, Radio New Zealand. Yeah, that's what happened.
And you, those who have heard the Juggernaut podcast will have heard you crop up a few times.
I know. And my only defence is that I just got back from England, right? So I relapsed. And I came back with that extraordinary English voice, right?
What did you sound like?
I thought, I sounded like an English rose who'd smoked a few too many cigarettes. But nevertheless, it was pretty full on, wasn't it, that accent?
I thought about whether it would be the responsible thing to do to include a kind of a warning.
A glossary.
No, an alert to
Subtitles.
listeners that there is not an issue with your playback speed. She just spoke that quickly at that point.
Oh, quickly you're saying?
Very fast.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Oh, no, I didn't notice that.
Yeah.
You sure you didn't put me on speed play?
And there was that, did you remember that bit you did where you did an April Fool? A very elaborate April Fool.
Yeah, we did that.
About how the Treasury was going to be corporatised and privatised.
Yeah.
That was great.
Yeah.
It was Christmas when I stumbled on that late one night, wading through the archives.
Those were the days. Look, I found something else too. Can I read something else? This is my favourite thing.
Is it Tartuffe?
No, it's not Tartuffe. I'm very taken. I was very... You know, I loved Longy. Everybody loved Longy. Because he was, in a way, an anti... I watched that Boris Johnson documentary the other night. And I thought, yep, very similar. Very similar charisma factor, you know, the kind of vaguely shambling, oh, shucks, and I'm not really a politician, but oh. And I like that flawed, self-deprecating thing, and I think it was genuine. I mean, I think that he was a fat, lonely guy, and suddenly he became very attractive. So listen to this. His was a subtle character full of highs and shades, lights and shades. He was certainly the most dominating character in a not uninteresting community. Indeed, there's no doubt that he would carry weight in any gathering, but few realised how shy and reserved the man was. Plus, he was sensitive to a fault, and leadership for such a man may be almost a martyrdom. Temperamentally, he was a weak man, had moods, depressions which might last for weeks. What pulled him through was character, sheer good grain, which ran over and under his weaker self and clamped it together. Naturally so peevish, highly strung, irritable, depressed, moody, practically such a conquest of himself, such push and determination, such personal and magnetic charm. He was naturally an idle man. Don't sue me. With a horror of leaving those dependent on him in difficulties. His greatest triumph was that by which he conquered his weaker self and became the strong leader whom we went to follow and came to love. Now, do you know what that description is of?
Well, I'm going to guess it's of David Longy.
No, it's not. But thank you for that.
That was the answer you wanted me to give you, wasn't it? Yeah.
It's of Robert Falcon Scott, and it's by Apsley Sherrod Gerard in a book called The Worst Journey in the World. And I love that description because it's like this guy was really, really tricky and flawed and in many ways broken, but he was fabulous. And that's how I think about Longy. I'm sorry, I'm going on a bit.
Was Longy highly strung?
Yeah, I reckon.
But
he was so clever. Clever people are highly strung.
One of the things that really comes through, and comes through, I think, in other interviews and things that they do as well as just the podcast, is even Douglas, you know, who fell out terribly with Longy or was fired by Longy, just speaks about him with such great affection. You know, he's still, you know, conjures up this image of going and listening to Longy, making them all laugh after press conferences and hearing him talk. And I don't think, you know, I mean, Douglas was so sort of focused on everything.
Douglas had a charisma bypass.
Oh, Douglas would have.
Longy was everything that Douglas would have liked to be in another life, right?
Oh, yeah, and they were very good friends. And the thing is, Douglas was so sort of focused on the mission that, you know, when he was fired by Longy, that would have just been like, you know, driving along a motorway and you think you might have hit something and you'd look back. But Douglas was sort of, you know, but he still like really, you can tell how much he liked Longy. And the weird thing is that the criticism of Longy about being, you know, from your non-description of Longy, about, you know, there was this sort of idea that he was just a salesman. You know, he was the charismatic front piece, a sort of useful idiot.
He said that of himself.
He said that of himself towards the end, and I think he bought into the criticism. You know,
but in a way, that's a deflection of responsibility, right?
That's right, and none of his cabinet ever said that.
They made me do it. You know, I didn't know what I was doing. They just made me get up and talk, and so I did my thing, and lo and behold.
But he did try. He did try to push back, and especially in that second term, with the Royal Commission on Social Policy, changing some portfolios, taking education himself. There were efforts to kind of, steer a slightly different course.
Yeah.
But one of the problems he had is he didn't have any faction around him, and this is him being quite a loner, really. He didn't really know how to build a faction. He didn't know how to do that stuff. Maybe as a curse of being so fucking smart, everyone talks about how you would hand him this 8-page briefing paper and he'd sort of flick through it, and you go, I wish he'd bloody read it. And then you'd ask him a question and he digested the whole thing almost instantly. But that was the contradiction, that he was a paradox, wasn't he?
He would remember names like you would not believe.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, I just think is remarkable because I don't remember anybody's name. Mark. But no, I mean, and maybe he did it in an effort to be engaging, but I don't know. He had one of those brains that I admired hugely.
Did you, when you were working on Checkpoint and then latterly Morning Report, all that, did you realise at the time just what a sort of seismic thing was happening? Or were you just doing it every day?
I was thinking about that. No, it's only now, you look back. I listened to Juggernaut and I know all that stuff. But I listen to it and I think, oh my God, really? That was the way it happened. It's amazing. I mean, it was a revolution. And revolutionaries never end up in a good place. They always end up shot up or, wearing bulletproof vests in some sanctuary. And it was a revolution.
Was there strong resistance to what was happening at the time?
Well, you were here. I wasn't even here.
True. But I was at primary school.
It's cussing, isn't it?
Is that a humble brag?
Who was here? I'm the oldest person. I wasn't even here.
But one question, because sort of a preoccupation I have with the 80s Labour government, and it comes from sort of the way people use the words neoliberalism now, and it kind of gets blamed for every bad thing as neoliberal, right? And I think we saw this in Eleanor Catton's, high-profile literary feud with the critic John Key, where she accused, she talked about New Zealand being a sort of neoliberal, sort of anti-intellectual country. And, in Juggernaut, of course, there's some great audio of Muldoon on the campaign trail in 1981 warning about the intellectuals who want to take over the country. New Zealand's obviously always been very anti-intellectual for totally different reasons than just the market. But in the 80s, I think, it's really, it stands out, particularly in the New Zealand, politics since, as the kind of idea where sort of raw ideas reshaped things more than anything else. Now it's sort of focus groups or incrementalism or, technocratic kind of solutions to a lot of things.
Those were the days where you could ride roughshod over the electorate.
Yeah. I was thinking, when Douglas is describing his sort of blitzkrieg, once you took away the privileges of one part of society, they would be supporters of taking away the privileges from others. It's like you read that in Martin Niemöller quote, first they came for the socialists, and he was like, oh no, way too many people to organise after that. We need to do it all at once.
Yeah, it was astonishing, really, when you think about it. And then when Longy. Do you remember when Longy said, I'm not going to have this flat tax? No, I'm not going to do it. And it all fell apart. I was in some yacht in the Bay of Islands. I'm just an imposter, complete imposter.
What a life you led.
I know.
What was the 80s?
None of us could sail. It was a nightmare.
But one other sort of part of what happened over that period is the communications industrial complex began and grew. And listening back, Kim, to the interviews of the time, I listened to many, it felt like the politicians of both stripes mostly came in to engage with the questions they were asked.
Yeah.
Which seems a bit of a novelty now.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
and again, this is across all parties, that people are so well prepared by excellent spin doctors and communications experts.
Thank you, Ben.
That was it different? I mean, am I right that it was different?
Yeah, I think people had beliefs. No, I mean, they believed, they had ideals, they had ideology, if you like. That's not the case now. Do you think, Ben? I mean, it's just a shuffling towards the...
I think Thomas Coughlin wrote in a column that everybody in Parliament was listening to Juggernaut and sort of enviously thinking about the kind of pace of change and the sort of things that they could do. And yeah, I think that's right. You know, everything is subjected to... everything's subjected to, and not necessarily focus groups, you know, it's too expensive, but certainly common political wisdom at the very least. And you had these guys who, you know, by one account thought that they would only get 3 years, by one account are absolutely driven. I mean, Douglas hasn't changed. If Douglas later in life, you know, when he came back as an ACT MP, if he was ever put, you know, behind the one-way glass, you know, for a focus group, he would have burst through the wall like the Kool-Aid man and started explaining to everyone in the room what, you know, why they were wrong. You know?
I mean, there's Douglas, totally lacking in charisma, and then there was Geoffrey Palmer. You know, on the other side, I still, don't you remember, you must remember, God, maybe you don't even remember, somebody here must remember, when Longy had resigned and Geoffrey was sitting alongside him. He said, I want to thank you, David, for this applause. It was fantastic, blah, blah. And David said, Geoffrey, I've changed my mind. You know, lines like, your body may be a temple, but mine's a warehouse. Oh, God, I miss
I think there were 2 volumes of a book of, you know, quips and quotes by David Longy published.
Yeah.
Sold read. I can't think there'd be much appetite for those these days. Maybe a short Wikipedia page. How are we going for time? Have we got time for a couple of questions? What do you think, Ihear? Oh, by the way, Ihear Butler is up there, ladies and gentlemen. The true hero. The true hero. We didn't really talk about what we were going to do questions, did we?
Questions from the audience?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Shall we?
Stick up your hand if you got a question.
Oh, thanks.
We'll bring
I'm running this fucking event.
Sorry. We can bring you a microphone if you want to ask a question of any of these bold people.
Who's got a question? Somebody does. The question was, if it was so terrible in the first term, why do you think they did get re-elected in 1987? I mean, the polling went pretty well after 1984. I think part of it would have been because everyone understood, as it was played out so dramatically in front of everyone, just what an absolute clusterfuck Muldoon had left. So there was a sort of sympathy for the cause. Longy obviously was on the world stage. He'd done the Oxford Union, which was an absolute global phenomenon. There was a sense of parochialism behind the ANZUS thrust, so there was that too. And I mean, I think the other thing is the pain that came from many of the changes that were made hadn't necessarily ripped its way through large parts of New Zealand at that point.
And it wasn't evenly shared, right? I mean, you guys were in cities during the 80s. You were wearing Nikes and share millionaires at the age of 8. You know,
that's right.
You had $1 million worth of Equity Corp shares.
One of the things that Longy said was that, and his heart wasn't in it in 1987. I think he said he nearly put himself to sleep with some of his speeches. He was already a bit of a shell of a man, but on election night itself, he describes in various places seeing Labour come within, I think, 400 votes of winning Remuera.
He said that's when I knew that Labour lost its soul.
Yeah. It
was due to Tizard, right?
Yeah.
She said, Doug Graham just won Remuera about 460 votes. He said, I knew we'd taken a wrong turning at that point.
But that's definitely a big part of it. It took a while for the consequences to be known and felt. And because it was primarily in provincial places like Murupara, Minginui, and all of those ones that really bore the brunt of it, it's not like those places are swimming in TV cameras and 6 o'clock reporters. So it took a little while for it to filter out. And it really wasn't until it started affecting other people, other communities, that it became really known and understood.
The last thing to add to that is just that the national opposition was in a state as well, having Muldoon clung on for quite some period of time, then Macleay came in, and then eventually he was rolled for Bolger, and so there had not been a sense really of the National Party having got its house in order by that point.
Do you think that there was also the idea that, I mean, it was a revolutionary government, and people thought, okay, it's hurting, but we'll give them another chance and maybe we're going to get to Shangri-La after all this pain?
I reckon there definitely would have been that, because, there were people that were getting super rich and living glamorous lifestyles and, giving up beer to take up drinking wine and those sorts of things. And people probably thought, if we stay the course, perhaps we too will...
can go sailing in the Bay of Islands.
Yes.
And look, remembering back to as a 5-year-old, it's not like everything was perfect. Early bedtimes, but also, but there were things like, we're coming out of, the UK had just joined the EEC. It wasn't as if this kind of came out of nowhere and sort of all of this pain would have been avoidable if, and so I think there was this sort of sense that, Longy could make the argument and he could persuade people that it was necessary. One of the things Douglas always talked about was, and he talks in Juggernaut, he's talking about privilege all the time. And one of the things he always said he was most proud of was, in terms of things that resonate today, he was proud of gutting Wellington of company headquarters. He said that it was the best sign for New Zealand that large companies wanted to move their headquarters away from government and towards where customers were in Auckland. Because previously it had just been about lobbying and trying to get licenses and subsidies and trade protections. And, the most bizarre sort of thing looking back at it is apparently, this is just from things that I've read, when I was doing some securities law papers, guys like Michael Fay and Richway, they were seen as these sort of, kind of business heroes, because prior to that, because of the system of licenses and subsidies and sort of preferential treatments, it was basically the same sort of 10 families that run all the business in New Zealand for the last 100 years, or 80 years or so. And so it really was seen as, ironically, it was seen as this kind of democratization. Somebody said, can we get rid of these oligarchs and this oligopoly, and the monkey's paw kind of closed, and
What what would Douglas say to that? I want to get rid of privilege. And in fact, he created a kleptocracy.
Well, I can tell you, because I asked him when he was running for... I didn't say kleptocracy.
It's hard to say. Try it again. Kleptocracy.
In interviews with things like, this is in the past, but he's said that, the benefit of privatising telecom, say, was getting phones installed within a day instead of a month, and bringing competition into the market. And I think he's answered and said, if we sold it for $0, it would have been worth it. As opposed, instead of sort of just selling it cheap to Michael Fay and David Richway, I think, who've been engaged to do the sale and then found some buyers who were them.
One other note on that sort of share market exuberance that you talked about, which I'm not sure it ended up making its way into the podcast, but is a very sobering thought, which Peter Harris made. We spoke to him about how a number of people, certain number of people who were made redundant in the corporatisation period, got this wad of cash they'd never seen the likes of in their life as a redundancy payout. Some of the redundancy payouts are quite generous. and looked around and saw what was going on in the media and thought, well, obviously the sensible thing to do is to pile all of this into the stock market. And this was in sort of the middle of 1987. And so they did what seemed like a very intelligent, sensible thing to do based on everything that was happening at the time. And then they got sort of walloped twice, basically. Have we got time for one more question? One more question. Hello.
Is there any parallel to be made between 60-day plans and Roger Douglas shoving everything through at pace?
Ben?
What's a 60-day plan?
The government's current approach to the work plan.
Oh, they've got a 60-day plan.
Now they're quarterly.
We had a 100-day
Now
plan,
they're
and now we're on
90
quarterly plan.
90.7
We're on quarterly plan 2. So we're on the third plan. Yep.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the parallel is just the lesson that, Douglas's theory of change is do it quickly and make it irreversible. Then we had a counterpoint to that, which sort of, I think the Ardern government was sort of the summit of the peak of MMP politics, which was, well, if we just do everything incrementally and carefully and slowly, that's how you get change. That only beds in the status quo, as we've seen, working for families, that's bedded in. Minor sort of subsidies for the middle classes, that gets bedded in. Big structural reform, like, say, Three Waters, Māori Health Authority, if it only exists as a wiring diagram by the time the next government gets in, they're going to get rid of it, And so I think that this government has taken that lesson, which is you don't mess around. Just Ardern, her government wasted a lot of time. If you're going to do fair pay agreements, get together with Business New Zealand in a room to sort of chat it through, but don't give them a kind of veto for sort of 3 years before you'll do anything.
In retrospect, is that, a lot of that was because there was like working groups and they went on for ages and ages and ages. Is that what you should be doing on the opposition benches, is getting all of that research done about the stuff you want to change so you can hit the ground running once you get onto the Treasury benches?
Well, yeah, I mean, I would have thought that's just good practice to know what you... Well, I mean, that's actually a good point. Yeah, knowing what you want to do when you're in government is something that I think our major parties have sort of lost a bit
the trouble with the fourth Labour government is that critics would say that it wasn't laid out in advance, and that was part of the problem. Yeah. There was one more question at the back, and then we've got to go before I can see a finger pointing to the sky. Hello. Any through lines between the Longy government to the Clark government and then through to the Ardern government? What do you think, Kim? I mean, the Clark government was very alert to... Clark had been in the government in the last part of it, and they were very conscious of the impressions, the shadow as they went in.
I think David Long himself said that he kept a fairly low profile. He was a bit of an embarrassment to Helen Clark.
Apart from writing columns in the paper every single
Well, just being there, was a reminder of the fourth Labour government that, Labour spent a lot of time distancing itself from in subsequent years. I don't know where the Ardern government fits in, really, because it was so dominated by COVID, it was twisted out of conventional shape.
I mean, there was certainly a few interesting sort of echoes, I guess, when you look at the Ardern leadership and the Longy leadership. Different kinds of leaders, but both able to, inspire a crowd, both pretty good at talking on their feet. And the other detail I think that is interesting is both found towards the end of their prime ministerships that it was much more rewarding and interesting and satisfying to be overseas, where people looked at you in the whole, rather than being at home. Longy gave this speech in Yale, which kind of finished him off in a way. But, similarly, Ardern, and who can blame them, both of them, when they've got all this internecine shit going on in their own parties, all of this loathing going on in the opposition and the wider populace, who can blame them for wanting to be somewhere else? Well, I think that we're done. Or are we? But do you have one last Postscript.
No, I've been working away on this using my powerful subconscious has been at play. Well, you've been talking. I think the other through line, Ruth Dyson.
Ruth Dyson.
Did she?
Okay.
What about it?
Was she in all three? Was she not an MP in the first?
Was she in a junior whip in the first one or something? Yeah.
Don't remember if she was in.
Is Ruth Dyson here? No. Oh, so we can't help you, Ben. Sorry.
Is Michael Bassett here?
We didn't manage not to talk
That's
about Michael
shame,
Bassett.
isn't it?
He's outside watching with binoculars.
Look, what have I got to say here? I've got a lot of thanks to deliver from the bottom of my heart. No, the first thing to say is the next event in Wellington, the next spin-off event right here, is Help Me Here Alive on Sunday, September the 8th. Big thank yous to Isabel McKinnon, Scott Maxim and the Hannah Playhouse, Tina Tiller, Ben Fagan, Amber Easby and Arafati Connell, Angela Windust, Bats and Embassy Theatre for their furniture. I love that Bats is holding up downstage now by providing furniture. It's a flip on the old days. Te Aihe Butler, round of applause for Te Aihe Butler. Woo! Thanks to contributors to the Welly 500 and spin-off members. Thanks to all those who took part in Juggernaut and came along today. Thanks to New Zealand On Air. Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Annabelle. Thank you, Kim. Thank you, beloved audience. We'll be back soon. Thank you.
The Spin-off Podcast Network.